A breakthrough in the 1972 murder case of a 12-year-old Boardman boy.
In a press conference this afternoon, Boardman's police chief revealed they believe they know who's responsible for the murder.
It's a case that's been unsolved for almost 51 years. 12-year-old Brad Bellino left his friend Donald Templeton's house to walk home on Friday, March 31st, 1972, but he never made it. A store owner found his body in a dumpster behind the Boardman Plaza 4 days later. Now investigators say they believe they've solved the case.
In a small town in Ohio, on an ordinary Friday evening, at almost exactly the time you might be reading this, a 12-year-old boy checked the clock, said goodbye to his best friend, and started walking home. He never made it. For 51 years, the man who stopped him lived free. Not hiding. Not running. Driving a delivery truck 5 miles away, raising a family, saying good morning to his neighbors, while an entire town searched for an answer that was never more than a few streets over. This is the story of Brad Bellino. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly who did it, and exactly how he got away with it for half a century. Type your location below. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Cold Case Archive. We tell these stories the right way, verified, respectful, and complete. If that's the kind of true crime you're here for, hit subscribe now, because you will not want to miss how this one ends. Like this video if you're ready to go back to 1972. Let's begin. Boardman, Ohio, in the spring of 1972, was the kind of suburb that people who grew up elsewhere assume only existed in television. It sat just outside Youngstown, a steel town, proud and hard-working, where fathers clocked in at the mills and mothers ran households that were the center of the neighborhood. Doors were left unlocked. Kids rode bicycles for miles without anyone thinking twice. Boardman was safe. Everybody agreed on that. Nobody questioned it. That agreement ended in April of 1972, and it never fully came back. His full name was Bradley Lee Bellino. Everyone called him Brad. He was the youngest of 4 children, with 2 older brothers and an older sister ahead of him, in a house that, by every account, was warm, a little loud, and full of life. His mother worked as a buyer for a clothing company. His father worked shifts at the steel mill that employed half the neighborhood. Brad was small for his age, you could have mistaken him for a boy 2 years younger. But smallness never seemed to slow him down. His best friend, a boy named Don, would say years later that Brad was the one who came up with the ideas. Brad was the one who suggested the risk. Don was the one who went along with it. Hold on to that detail, it tells you something important about who Brad was. He wasn't a quiet kid drifting through his childhood. He was the one leading it. The two of them had been friends for years. 3 summers running, Brad crouched behind home plate as the catcher while Don pitched, with Don's father coaching from the sideline. They rode bikes everywhere. 3 miles felt like nothing to 2 boys with a whole town to explore. On Friday nights, they'd trade off whose house to sleep at, then walk to the drive-in together to catch whatever was playing. There was a small rock and gem shop near Brad's house, the kind of place 2 curious 12-year-olds gravitate toward on a slow afternoon, just to look at the stones in the case. It was nothing. Just a stop on the way to somewhere else. It would matter later. By every description anyone has ever given, this was an ordinary, happy childhood. Nobody in that family had any reason to believe it wouldn't stay that way. It was Easter break. No school. Brad had spent Thursday night at Don's house, the way they often did. Thursday afternoon, Brad's father had given permission for the sleepover, on the condition that Brad would be home by 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Plans shifted, the way they do with 12-year-olds. Brad called his father and asked for more time. His father agreed, but only until 9 that night. Friday was spent the way idle spring days are spent by 2 boys with nowhere they have to be, walking around Boardman with no particular destination. At some point, they noticed a van. Brown. Unremarkable. And then they noticed it again. And again. 3 or 4 times, in different parts of town. At first, they joked about it. Then the joke stopped being funny, and they headed back toward Don's house. Here's a detail that matters. That evening, Brad called his own house and told his older brother he'd be staying at Don's again. It seemed settled. But about 20 minutes later, his father called the Templeman house directly and told Brad to come home instead. 2 phone calls. 20 minutes apart. Pulling him in opposite directions. In the end, his father's voice won out. Brad did what he was told. The original plan was for Don's mother to drive Brad home, the way she usually did. But that evening, she was out at the grocery store. Don's father was in bed, sick. There was no ride available. So at 7:30 in the evening, with the sun going down, Brad said goodbye to his friend on Teakwood Drive, in the Applewood Acres neighborhood, and started walking home alone. He never arrived. Don went to bed not long after Brad left. Around 10 o'clock that night, Brad's older brother called the Templeman house, asking if Brad had made it back. Don's mother told him Brad had left hours earlier. Now genuinely alarmed, she woke Don, and the two of them got in the car and retraced the route Brad would have walked. They found nothing. Brad's father got home late that night, assumed his son had simply stayed over again, and went to bed without checking. He woke the next day, realized Brad wasn't home, called the Templeman house, and learned the truth: Brad had left the night before and never arrived. He went out searching immediately. By mid-afternoon, Brad was officially reported missing to Boardman police. For the rest of that weekend, family, neighbors, and officers searched the streets of Boardman. Brad had a bit of a reputation as a wanderer, and for a while, that reputation gave people hope. But when Easter Sunday came and went, a day this close family would never have missed together, the hope started to curdle into something else. There were scattered, unconfirmed sightings. A mall. A basketball court. A dairy freeze. All of them, it would later turn out, almost certainly wrong, most likely simple confusion between a Friday with no school and the ordinary Saturday that followed it. The search continued anyway. Because a search needs somewhere to look, and rumor was the only map anyone had. Then came Tuesday morning. At around 8 o'clock, a sanitation worker was collecting trash from a dumpster behind a dairy store in the Boardman Plaza. Underneath layers of garbage and cardboard, he made a discovery that would end one nightmare and begin an entirely different one. He had found Brad. The plaza was barely a mile from where Brad was last seen. The whole town had been searching outward, imagining some faraway location. The answer may have been sitting almost within walking distance of where the search began the entire time. A relative of Brad's, a police officer himself, was the one who had to make the identification. Decades later, he would say only this: "You are never prepared to do something like that. You just do it." The county coroner performed the examination and later told reporters, in words that made every local paper, that this was the act of a degenerate. It was as close to an explanation as anyone in 1972 was ever going to get. Here is what the evidence showed, delivered plainly and without unnecessary detail: Brad had been strangled. A belt was found around his neck. There were no signs he had fought back, no defensive marks, nothing consistent with a struggle, a detail that troubled investigators for decades. One expert would later suggest an explanation: certain conditions can bring on unconsciousness within seconds, before a struggle even has the chance to begin. The original report placed the time of death more than a full day after Brad was last seen. For 50 years, that gap sat at the center of the case, unexplained. Where was he during that missing day? Who had him? But there was a detail in that same examination that quietly argued against the accepted timeline. In Brad's stomach was his last meal, still only partially digested. Digestion does not wait an entire day. Decades later, when investigators looked at this case with fresh eyes, they reached a very different conclusion. Brad was almost certainly taken within hours of walking out that door on Friday night, not held somewhere for a day, the way everyone had assumed for half a century. The timeline that haunted this case from the beginning appears to have simply been wrong. Boardman in 1972 was a small department handling a case that would have tested a much larger one. Evidence was collected without much consistency. Leads piled up without a clear system for following through. The belt itself became its own small mystery. It was sized for a much younger child, small enough that some in the family couldn't even confirm it belonged to Brad at all. Investigators believed it came from a department store chain with a local branch, but could never trace a purchase to anyone. Brad was laid to rest at a cemetery in a funeral so crowded it was standing room only. Classmates, teachers, neighbors, nearly the entire school Brad and Dawn had attended together. For a town that had believed only days earlier that nothing like this could happen here, the funeral was the moment that belief finally, permanently broke. Then came the leads. Dozens of them. All dead ends, one after another. A man with a strange fixation on police work, eliminated. A local man, investigated and never charged. Whispered rumors about a theater worker, a man at a pizza shop. Hundreds of vehicles checked, including a sports car that led nowhere. Here is the uncomfortable truth about this stretch of the case, none of it went anywhere. Every name. Every tip. Every search warrant. Dead end. Dead end. Dead end. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story all the way to the end, because what's coming next is the part that finally cracked this case wide open. 29 years after Brad died, a former Boardman police chief reopened the case. Brad's clothing was sent to the state's forensic crime lab. And finally, a real breakthrough. Forensic scientists found DNA on Brad's clothing that did not belong to him. It belonged, almost certainly, to whoever had killed him. A profile was built and uploaded to the FBI's National DNA database. It came back with nothing. No match anywhere in the system. There were explanations, none of them satisfying. Some states hadn't yet required DNA collection from every offender before newer laws took effect. Some samples simply never happened, lost in the same kind of bureaucratic gap that swallows evidence in cases like this one across the country. It was entirely possible that Brad's killer had already crossed paths with law enforcement for something else, somewhere else, and simply slipped through one of those gaps. As it would eventually turn out, that wasn't far from the truth. Investigators went through decades of old paperwork and narrowed a long list of persistent names down to 7 men who kept surfacing in old police reports. None of them had enough against them to be called suspects outright. But using search warrants, detectives collected DNA samples from all 7. Every single one came back negative. 7 men eliminated. A belt with no traceable pattern. A national database with no match. And a case that had already outlived most of the people who first worked it. The break, when it finally came, didn't come from a witness or a confession. It came from a technology that didn't exist when Brad died. In 2018, Boardman police began working with a forensic genetic genealogy company, the same kind of technique that had recently helped identify a notorious serial killer in California. The idea: take an unknown DNA profile, and compare it against public genealogy databases, where ordinary people have voluntarily shared their own genetic information to research family history. Look for partial matches. Distant cousins. Build outward, branch by branch, generation by generation, narrowing an entire family tree down to one living person. It sounds simple when you say it that fast. It wasn't. This was a relatively new tool for law enforcement, and this case would end up being one of the more difficult trees anyone at the lab had worked through, precisely because the profile they were chasing belonged to a man who had done everything right to stay invisible. No criminal record worth mentioning. No prior arrests to flag him. Nothing but a distant thread of shared DNA connecting him to people who had never heard his name attached to anything. The genetic testing gave investigators a physical profile: a man of European descent, fair or very fair skin, possibly with freckles, brown or hazel eyes, black or brown hair. A start. Not an answer. For the next several years, investigators worked the family tree down, one branch at a time. They'd know from a percentage of shared DNA that the profile came from a particular section of the tree. Try this branch. Compare it. No, not this one. Move down again. It wasn't clean work. Family trees don't account for adoptions that were never documented, or births families quietly never spoke of. Not every distant relative wanted to give a sample voluntarily. The genealogy traced back through generations of one family, then worked forward again toward the present day. Each branch eliminated was, in its own way, a small defeat. And each one narrowed the field a little more. And then, finally, on the most recent branch of the tree, a living relative agreed to give a sample voluntarily. That relative was, by every account, appalled to learn what a member of their own family might have done. The sample was a match. 98.2% probability, according to the state's forensic crime lab. Not a perfect confirmation, because the man himself could no longer be tested directly. He had died years earlier, and been cremated. But a forensic scientist reviewed everything and stood behind the match. On a January afternoon in 2023, Boardman's police chief stood at a podium and said a name that had never once surfaced in 51 years of investigation. Joseph Norman Hill. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a stranger passing through town. In 1972, Joseph Norman Hill was 32 years old, married, and living on Shadyside Drive in Boardman, less than 5 miles from the Bellino family home. He drove a truck for a bottled water company, delivering bottles to homes and businesses around the very township where Brad lived. To everyone who remembered him, he was entirely unremarkable. Police found no connection at all between Hill and the Bellino family. As far as anyone can determine, Brad was not a target chosen because of who he was. He may simply have been a boy walking alone in the dark, on a night when there was no one available to give him a ride home. Think about what that actually means. While Boardman searched its streets for 4 days, questioning neighbors, chasing down a brown van and a sports car and hundreds of other vehicles that led nowhere, the man responsible was almost certainly still in town. Still going to work. Still coming home to his own family every night. He wasn't hiding in the shadows the way these stories usually go. He was in plain sight the whole time, doing something as ordinary as delivering water bottles to houses just streets away from where Brad's own family was searching for him. Hill moved his family to California in 1978, eventually settling in a small city in San Bernardino County. Over the following 4 decades, he lived an unremarkable life. His wife died in the early 1990s. His only recorded brush with the law came in the mid-1980s in Los Angeles, a single arrest, nothing that raised any alarm at the time. He died in an assisted living facility in the summer of 2019, of natural causes. Never questioned. Never charged. He had been dead for 3.5 years by the time his name was finally spoken in that room in Boardman. The Mahoning County prosecutor told reporters that had Hill still been alive, there was enough evidence to bring the case before a grand jury, that in all likelihood, it would have led to his indictment. But he wasn't alive. And so the only justice this case would ever produce was a name, spoken out loud, 51 years too late. There's something about this case that stays with you longer than the details of the crime itself. It's not just that Brad Bellino's killer was never caught in his lifetime. It's how close he was, the entire time. 5 miles. A delivery route through the same streets. A man nobody ever looked at twice, because there was never any reason to. For 51 years, an entire community carried a question it couldn't answer. And in the end, the answer wasn't hiding in some far-off place nobody thought to check. It was already there. It had always been there. Sometimes the only thing that closes a case like this isn't a witness, or a confession, or even justice in the way we usually mean it. Sometimes it's just time, patience, and a science that didn't exist yet when the question was first asked. If this story affected you the way it affected us putting it together, do 3 things before you go. Hit like, so more people find this story and the family gets the recognition this case deserves. Subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, because we bring you cases like this every single week, verified, respectful, and told all the way to the end. And drop a comment letting us know, which detail in this case got to you the most. We read every single one. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next case.